Nick Carter and a few other people have been uh, pointing out that, hey, like, you need to compare apples to apples here. Like, what Bitcoin's trying to do is sort of replace. It's actually competing with the dollar. It's not competing with like Visa. It's competing with like the dollar. So you have to be honest in terms of your comparison. So when you talk about the cost of like a Visa transaction, you have to actually look at the full stack, the full financial stack of what that means, and go all the way down, right? And that's something I started to dig in more to. There's a really great piece by an investor named Susan Su who talks about the climate impact of the dollar, and that got me thinking as well. This was like back in January or February. Um, so I just started diving into this quite deeply, and I didn't really know much about the petrodollar. It's not spoken very widely about. Like, for example, there's this book, famous book about energy and oil called The Quest by Daniel Yergin. And I don't even think he mentions the petrodollar in the book. So there are a lot of people who study energy markets, oil, geopolitics, who don't even talk about the petrodollar. It's kind of a weird thing. It's kind of hidden a little bit. Um, but when you actually dig in, I mean, the facts are really striking. I mean, and the history is really compelling. And obviously, securing the petrodollar pact was like of the highest importance for Nixon and Kissinger in 1974. This was super important. Like, they brought the Saudis to Washington. President Nixon went to Saudi Arabia a week later. This was like something that they were extremely focused on, even as the war in Vietnam was, winding down, and Nixon was on on the brink of essentially getting forced out of office. This was hugely important. So you can look at the facts, and a lot of these documents have actually been declassified, and you can read them. And yeah, we made this deal with this dictatorship in the Middle East, and it has forever colored the world since then. So it was very compelling to learn more about.
Awesome. That was some great kind of background there, especially around your history, having to kind of defend invading Iraq. You go kind of into detail with, pretty much that has kind of gone into actually securing and backing up and maintaining the petrodollar standard kind of after the fact, and how every single war kind of was built on top of that. Do you kind of want to, like, I guess, before we get there, just kind of like go a little bit more into the actual history and research that you did in terms of this? Like, what was the history behind wars that kind of forced the gold window to close and then forced Nixon to even be in that position to have to make the deal?
Sure. So, like, one thing that's important to note um, is that the dollar was becoming um, already the most powerful national currency. It wasn't a fiat currency yet, but after World War One, the U.S. was just in a much better position than the European powers. We had a lot more gold, and the dollar started to supersede the pound. This kind of escalated through the 30s and through World War II. So as World War II was winding down, the U.S. was in such a favorable balance of payments position versus the other countries that we could kind of force our way. And we brought all the allies together in New Hampshire at Bretton Woods, very nice hotel. I've been there. um, and we kind of sat down, and despite the opinions of some of the other countries, like some of the other countries wanted to have a system where all the nations would sort of co-manage a kind of unit of account called the Bancor. There were some other plans, but basically we got our way with all the leverage we had to have the global financial system run on the dollar pegged to gold. And over the next 2 decades, this was called the Bretton Woods system, and this is something that relied on trust, because other countries actually, not only did they rely on this peg and for us to hold the peg, but also actually the actual physical custodying of the gold was a lot of it was in, whether it was Fort Knox or in the New York Federal Reserve building in New York City. So governments would redeem the gold for redeem the dollars they had for gold. over these decades. And at first, it sort of worked. It seemed to work okay um, until sort of when JFK was assassinated. There was a huge change in a lot of American policies, right? So when Johnson came in, we really escalated the war in Vietnam, and we really escalated social spending, right? So this is called guns and butter, was like the way people described it at the time. So the interesting thing is that Vietnam was like, and there's like a bunch of scholarly work on this, but was really the first war we fought on credit. So the other wars we had fought relied a lot also on taxation. Look at if you look at the Korean War, World War II, not entirely, of course, but like significantly, let's say. So Nixon did not raise taxes, or this was like not one of his core policies, right? So this war was like they tried to fight it entirely on credit, which was a new concept. So this led in the late 60s a lot of foreign powers to get nervous about the US and our ability to hold this peg that we had promised. The British actually failed to hold their system together through a bunch of like their empire was collapsing, and the pound was under a lot of pressure, and eventually they had to devalue it in 1967. And the French were really concerned that this would happen to the dollar as well, and that the whole system would fall. So they were like very interested in getting essentially getting their gold out of the U.S. hands, because before a dollar devaluation, they had all these dollar assets. They wanted to get the gold. So in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a lot of pressure from foreign countries who wanted to redeem their dollars for gold. And this actually came to a head in a couple weeks before Nixon went on TV and took us off the gold standard. It was really interesting digging this out, but basically, like, the French sent like a battleship to New York City to collect the gold that was in the Fed in New York, and the British asked for like $3 billion of gold to be withdrawn, to be moved from Fort Knox to New York in preparation for withdrawal. So basically, foreign nations were like done with trusting the U.S. government. So this was really what caused Nixon and his advisors to make this decision to go off the gold standard. Really, what is known now as like the closing the gold window, or like the gold, the Nixon shock, right? And there's some really interesting White House tapes that you can look at that again have been declassified, which you can read them, and it's like the conversations with Nixon and his advisors. And it's funny because he's quite callous about it. Like, there's obviously going to be huge ramifications of this. And at one point, he's just like, someone's talking to him about Italy, one of our important allies, etc. He's just like, I don't give a shit about the era. It's kind of crazy. So you can, again, you can read all these historical documents, and essentially, in order to finance the war in Vietnam and social spending without unrest, they decided to do, and it didn't, it didn't really work. Like, it staved off like economic catastrophe. um but Nixon and Kissinger especially, and at that point Kissinger, if he was not only Secretary of State, he was also National Security Advisor. He was very, very powerful, and he actually he lived politically way past Nixon, obviously, into the next administration. So they realized they needed to do something to restore faith in the dollar. Obviously, all these countries around the world had dollars. I mean, dollars were dominant, but they weren't backed by anything anymore. I mean, no government could redeem them for gold, and there was huge inflation. So as a consequence of closing the gold window, the dollar devalued about 10%, like immediately, and then we continued to have high inflation here, especially in 1973. All these oil countries, led by Saudi Arabia, in retaliation for American support for Israel, they decided to quadruple the price of oil and embargo the U.S. So we were under like immense pressure here. Um, so like as a reaction to this, Kissinger and Nixon decided to try and do a deal with the Saudis that would like prolong the dollar and strengthen international demand for the dollar. Obviously, as I've just covered, there was like a history of the previous 5 years of international skepticism about the dollar, people wanting to redeem the dollar for gold. So we stopped their ability to do that but we needed to keep interest in the dollar higher. Like we wanted people to want the dollar. So Nixon and Kissinger designed this, actually, in retrospect, really brilliant plan to like link the dollar to oil. So basically, there were these series of meetings that took place in 1974. Um, Crown Prince Fahd came to Washington in June. Nixon went to Saudi Arabia uh, a week later, and then later our new Treasury Secretary Simon, he went out to Jeddah, right? And so throughout this year, all these deals were ironed out. But essentially, with the plan they came up with um, is something called petrodollar recycling. Um, and what they decided to do was a deal that worked both for the Saudis and for us, right? So the Saudis got weapons and protection. All they had to do was price their oil in dollars, and then sort of pledge to, uh, with the profits, with the petrodollar profits. A petrodollar is just an oil that is a dollar that is spent on oil. So with these like petrodollars they were receiving, from countries around the world who were buying oil from them, because OPEC at the time had 80% of the world's oil. Um, they would take that and then they would just invest that right back into U.S. debt, right back into U.S. Treasuries. They started buying them in the spring of 1975, right? So billions of dollars of them. So essentially, what was created is this ability for the U.S. to run up these massive deficits because there was this huge international demand for the dollar. And even skeptics who say the petrodollar is not very important now, and I would agree, it's certainly not as important as it used to be. But for those initial like years, I mean, this was massive, and it really helped in the Cold War. Really put a lot of pressure on the Soviets. I mean, this allowed America to literally print money and buy. We could just print money and buy energy with it. I mean, the Soviets couldn't do that. They had to either get dollars or dig the oil out of the ground. So this gave us a huge political advantage over the Soviets. That was certainly a factor in their economic collapse, which led to their political collapse. So I think Nixon and Kissinger knew what they were doing. It seemed a bit of a risk, but it really paid off. But it has come with like just such enormous consequences for a lot of other people around the world.
Yeah, yeah, and I know that there's a lot of people raising their hands. They want to join. We are going to open it up to questions in a little bit, but there's just so much history to dig into here. I want to transition into like the second, third order effects, right? So obviously, this strengthened the U.S. dollar hegemony greatly. But can you, in the article, you dig into a lot, like you effectively just list all of the kind of like obvious second, third order effects here. Do you want to kind of dive into that?
Sure. And again, people will dispute how much, and it's hard to say because everything is there's so many different factors happening in the world in the 70s and 80s. But um, I make the case, and others do too, that this pact with the Saudis ended up triggering a lot of network effects. I think one of the key things is to think about the fact that all these countries around the world who were industrializing at the time and who were discouraged from pursuing energy independence. I mean, it's important to note that after the 1973 oil shock, a lot of countries wanted to pursue nuclear power. They didn't want to be reliant necessarily on buying oil, but that was like really discouraged by the World Bank, by the IMF, by the US. We didn't really want like other countries to be nuclear independent. So, and I think a lot of that is linked to our wanting to remain dominant with the petrodollar system and to keep the fossil fuel industry strong. There's a lot that you can look into there, but essentially, all of these countries around the world had to prioritize accumulation of dollars to pay for energy at the expense of domestic investment in their own countries, right? So that's like one huge network effect that happened. So you saw a lot of these like export-led economies because if you're like Malawi or Taiwan or Korea, like there's only really two ways you can get dollars. You can either export goods and services to the U.S. Or you can buy them, which is like not ideal. And the other network effect that's worth noting is that because like you as a country are buying dollars or trying to export goods and services for dollars, that becomes like the dominant trading pair for your currency. And again, that helps the what was originally simply just a deal for oil ended up having so many impacts on other industries as well. So you had geopolitics impact, right? I covered how this really helped us in the Cold War. It was really a stress for emerging market countries, what were known at the time as third world countries, because they had all this dollar denominated debt, and they kind of had to focus on paying back that debt in dollars and accumulating dollars to pay that debt, service that debt, and buy oil instead of investing in their own countries. So you saw like so much economic stress over the 80s and 90s, everywhere from like Argentina to Mexico, Russia. I mean, a lot of countries had like huge financial issues that were related to this sort of arrangement. Um, on the sort of financial side, uh, you had this sort of financialization of the world where um, after this moment, both domestically in America and internationally, there was a lot more leverage in the system. So like a lot more like derivatives, things like that popped up. A lot of these petrodollars were like invested in what are called like euro dollar accounts. So these are like dollar denominated accounts outside of the Federal Reserve's control. And the euro dollar market now is absolutely massive, but it really started escalating after the petrodollar was created. So this is like sort of another effect has been the sort of financialization and leveraging of the world's economy. And then domestically in the United States, of course, what this led to was, really the strengthening of the dollar, this kind of what some people call an artificial demand on the dollar, which obviously led to, uh, our manufacturing base being uncompetitive internationally and kind of the hollowing out of the middle class in the United States and deepening inequality and the 1% getting a lot richer at the expense of others. And this has resulted in like our country being like kind of like pretty good in terms of like average wealth, but not sort of median wealth in terms of per capita. Like we're pretty high in per capita income on average because we have a lot of like mega billionaires, but in terms of median wealth, we're pretty low for an advanced economy. So a lot of this financialization that was a result partly of the petrodollar system led to like a huge amount of investment in America in like services and defense and technology and away from manufacturing, and that's caused like huge issues. Not the least being the fact that our supply chains are located in like geopolitical rivals. So there's a lot of like implications there. Um, there's also obviously geopolitical implications in as much as we had to sort of defend the system. So um, some people note that it would have made sense after the Berlin Wall fell for us to have like a new Bretton Woods and try to come together with the world again to like create a new system, but that didn't happen. The U.S. just simply decided to press on with like the unipolar moment. And what's really interesting, and I go into this in the essay, is that the euro was like a big challenger to the dollar. Like it was like American policymakers were very nervous about the euro. If the euro started being used widely, it could really like hurt this like sort of exorbitant privilege that we had, right? Um, so it, what I get into essentially is that this challenge that Saddam Hussein posed was like quite significant actually. So he started selling oil for dollars. He announced that he would do this in the year 2000, and then by like 2002, he was selling like 5% of the world's oil through the oil for food program essentially to like France and Germany in euros. And this was clearly a threat. The petro euro was a threat to the petrodollar, and a few months later, we invaded Iraq and changed the regime. And then by June 2003, the regime was back to selling oil in dollars again. And I think again, it's like impossible to know exactly how important this was to the decision makers, but like in retrospect, it really kind of worked. Meaning, other countries were like afraid to do this. They didn't want to do this necessarily. There were some other rogue regimes that tried. It didn't work out so well. Um, but generally speaking, this sort of action to defend the petrodollar, like basically like gave it another 15 to 20 years of life is essentially what I argue. At a time when America was still very strong. The thing is, and we kind of I conclude with this section in the piece today. We don't have that kind of hyperpower strength anymore. And there's not a whole lot we can do to prevent other countries from starting to price oil and other assets and things like that in their own currencies. So we're seeing like the kind of decline of the petrodollar system. But it lasted for 50 years. It was really important. It continues to last. Like, I mean, again, the dollar is still 60% of all the reserve currency held in the world by other countries, and 40% of all debt in the world is denominated in dollars, and something like 90% of all FX trade is still done with dollar as a dollar pair. So it's still really, really dominant, but it's clearly fading. And then, we're looking forward to like what's going to happen next.
So I know we don't have a whole lot of Matt Odell here. He would have to leave in like 30 minutes to do RHR. I'm curious if you have thoughts here, or have any questions that you want to pose towards Alex.
Dude, I mean, your piece is just fantastic. It was just really well researched. Um, I thought I knew all of this stuff already, but it's just extremely eye opening. Uh, Even though I think like Bitcoiners are particularly more aware of the kind of intricacies here, we're all kind of. I think I could speak for most of us that we were all kind of not not really as familiar as we thought we were. I think I'm curious your thoughts on, to me, I've always had like a twofold strategy when it comes to Bitcoin education, and that is first make people aware of what issues we have and the trade-offs that are present, and then give them options that they can actually, go and improve their current situation based on that awareness. So here I feel like there's a major lack of awareness, but especially in the mainstream, but even in Bitcoin land, like how can we make it more, like how can we make people more aware of how, almost ridiculous the system is?
Yeah, no, and I got really distressed writing it and learning about it. I mean, again, just like the oil piece, the dictator piece, the war piece, and then the sort of like, decline of our own society in many ways are all connected. These are all the costs that we pay for the dollar, and it gives us incredible privilege. Like I write this in the piece, but like I've been very privileged by this. Obviously, like the U.S. has been able to run up enormous deficits. And as many macro thinkers point out, normally when a country does this, there's like a devaluation of the currency, and there's like a natural balancing effect that happens where they start to do more exports because it becomes more favorable. And that's, again, never really happened to us because we have this international demand for our currency. So even though we have these like wild deficits, people still really need and want our currency. And again, this thing was all designed. So I think it's just like important to talk about these matters and debate them. And what's interesting actually is, in the research I was doing, what I saw is that there's almost like a, that meme where it's like, uh, the two arms, like, arm wrestling, and they're sort of like handshaking. It's sort of like, the left wing historians have been really on the money on the petrodollar, in my opinion. Like they've been quite honest, and like the book. I mean, David Graeber's book, which I disagree with in a lot of, obviously in a lot of areas. Um, he's like really, he really sort of has an amazing explanation of this whole process. And there's a lot of other like very left wing historians who also write prolifically about this. So there's kind of this interesting, almost like apolitical understanding of this. I think a lot of Bitcoiners, regardless of their politics, kind of grasp this, even maybe intuitively. And then again, there's like a lot of like really left wing, hardcore left wing academics and writers who also are looking at the inequities of the petrodollar system. So I think it's a moment for like hopefully more people to think about this, to think about putting even Bitcoin aside, like what allows us to keep pushing forward our existing system. And I hope that we can just keep talking about it and keep referring to it, and in the hopes that we can build something better, right? I mean, I guess the conclusion I have in the piece is that I don't see, even if we go to a Bitcoin based world where like Bitcoin is the reserve currency as opposed to the petrodollar system and the US Treasury, I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing for America, right? Like, I think America would be quite dynamic and powerful in a Bitcoin world. Like, we have so much infrastructure, so much development, so much holdings. Like, I think we'd be extremely competitive compared to other countries. So, um, I, I just think it's possible that we can be dynamic and world leading, but without all these horrible downsides. Like, we wouldn't have to stifle nuclear energy. We wouldn't have to support the Saudi Arabian dictatorship. We wouldn't have to, threaten with violence other countries if they try to disrupt like a currency pair. Like I just think it kind of is a almost optimistic ending. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, as a Bitcoiner, I was wondering like if my bias was showing, but basically, seems like you've come to the same conclusion. Like we kind of just are gonna be forced to just watch this thing blow up, and at least we have Bitcoin to opt out to, right? Because it's like I don't know how the majority of people wake up to the reality of this system without getting burnt.
Yeah, and I refer to this like study, and it's in one of the academic journals, and they kind of cover four potential outcomes of where do we go from here, and one of them is like a essentially like regionalized system where like the dollar still is important, but we have like the euro and maybe the yuan. They also come up with a future of like essentially like this idea of like a SDR, which is like a special drawing right, which is a unit of account based on what Keynes came up with at Bretton Woods in 1944, which is like the Bancor. This idea of like a kind of like collaboratively managed unit of account between different nations, with like the BIS in charge. And I think obviously a lot of people are not going to want that. And then there's this idea of like the world just kind of retreating to like disconnected kind of islands, and then of course the status quo, like the US could just keep it going. So they kind of analyze these four different possibilities, and obviously I just think they missed the fifth possibility, which could be the Bitcoin standard. And it just seems to me somewhat inevitable that just like corporations are adopting Bitcoin as like this, like at first the narrative is like as like an inflation hedge, right? So you could see, I think sovereign wealth funds, central banks start to think about that, but over time, I think it's just going to be kind of like the new. That's just my opinion. Like I think it's going to be like the new reserve currency, and I think there's not enough like thought being going into what are the implications going to be for the world. But I do think that it would be really interesting, and I think it's really bad for a lot of these dictators. Like I want to be clear here. I think this is something that's like good for democracies and bad for dictators. It's interesting that a lot of the critics of the petrodollar system kind of are very like America hating, and I can feel that. I understand why, but I think that moving beyond the system is actually good for America. Like it's like so many of the things that I think we would be least proud of that are happening to our country and happening as a result of our presence can be checked or countered by moving to a different reserve currency that's neutral and open, as opposed to something that we manipulate.
Alex, I want to talk about MBS, right? So you're talking about some of the things that we are least proud of. Mohammed bin Salam, he's the prince of Saudi Arabia, and he's been kind of a part of a lot of things in recent history that I think most Americans would absolutely not consider to be like something that they would like to be aligned with, but yet here we are. We are allies with MBS. Do you kind of want to talk about like just go deeper into like our relationship with Saudi Arabia, the kind of like wars, dictatorships, and all of this kind of like human rights violations that have been enabled specifically with this partner and ally?
Yeah, so the like unflinching relationship with Saudi is worth dwelling on, and I think it's one of the things I tried to spend the most time looking at in the research. And it, first of all, the Saudi regime, ever since the end of the 1970s, has been like a prolific supporter of Islamic extremism around the Islamic world in terms of funding very radical thought, um, in terms of supporting extremist organizations and really in just like spawning a lot of terrorism. This is like pretty well established and pretty clear. This is non-controversial to say that. In addition, they call it like Wahhabism essentially. That there's a lot of discourse and research on this. In addition, of course, more recently, in addition to oppressing their own people and spreading terrorism around the world. Again, remember, 15 of the 19 hijackers from 9/11 were literally Saudis, and Bin Laden is Saudi. I mean, like again, the Saudi regime has, by direct support and by indirect blowback, created a lot of extremism around the world, and we've been like supporting this House of Saud the whole time. But in addition to that, you have human rights violations. The regime is particularly nasty. It tortures female political prisoners. It keeps human rights lawyers in jail. It still executes people by beheading. I mean, we're talking one of the world's worst human rights violators. And then you have the war on Yemen, which is horrific. I mean, and being weapons. So, I mean, we are, continually supporting this kind of horrific kingdom, this kind of, in many ways, a medieval kind of kingdom, and our political and economic classes continue to support these people, and we refuse to sort of condemn them. Like, we have a intelligence service telling the Biden administration that MBS ordered the murder of Khashoggi. This was the topic of HRF's recent film, The Dissident. Like, we now have like the intelligence services in America have like told Congress and the Biden administration that basically we have all this evidence that MBS directly ordered it. And Biden said that we couldn't punish MBS directly because it would be too costly for America. And Trump basically said the same thing. Like, he was like, "What, are you kidding? Like, I'm not gonna like not do business with these people." And over time, over the last decade, you've just seen this again and again, where like there's been like motion to go after the Saudis for either monopoly in energy or in their role in 9/11, and it's been stopped by like the U.S. government because of this pact we have. And numerous times, and again, this is not conspiracy. This is like in the New York Times. These articles that I'm quoting, like the Saudis were threatening to like end the petrodollar system if we were like to investigate the role in 9/11 or try to like bring any action against them for like monopolistic business practices. So like they have been using this relationship to prevent Americans from like looking too deeply into their matters. So basically, I think you can make a case that the main reason the House of Saud still stands is because of American support, and they are responsible not just for like tons of domestic repression in their own country, but like a lot of, again, like extremism throughout the world, and really like a terrible war in Yemen, which is not talked about enough.
Anyone else who's on the panel want to jump in, ask anything for Alex? All right. Well, speak now, forever hold your peace. I'll just keep rolling. Alex, I really enjoyed this one. One of the details that you really got into is like this mechanism of, buying treasuries with the petrodollar, recycling it. You talked about how, that is kind of used in order to, continue demand for American debt and bonds. But on the flip side, you also talk about how that is one of the forces that are driving interest rates down. Can you kind of talk a little bit more about like what's kind of happening underneath the financial plumbing, and like how is that coming to a head today?
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of the macro thinkers describe this, but obviously, if there's a lot of demand, for debt, the interest rates can be really low, and that has like really kind of loose, easy effects on the economy, right? So I think the whole point is that if the U.S. dollar was not tied to oil in this way, and if there were not this like, I don't want to say artificial is probably the wrong word, but if there weren't this like additional demand for the dollar from countries around the world in the 70s and 80s to have to get it to be able to buy oil, and still today, I mean, again, this is declining, But as of a couple of years ago, something like 99% of all crude oil trades were still done in dollars. Again, it's been declining, and I think you're going to see that continue to decline. But like clearly, the oil trade has been very reliant on dollars, and because of that excess demand for for dollars, and like an excess demand for treasuries as a result of the recycling system, it's allowed us to keep like lower rates, and that's obviously had, again, like a lot of sort of easy loose effects on our economies, ever since the mid 1980s, as we've kind of just kept going down and down and down and down in terms of interest rates, all the way down to sort of close to zero where we are today, right?
And I guess just to keep the conversation going along this route, right? Like, as interest rates go down, and as we kind of get to this zero bound, like now we're kind of being forced into this position where, the system doesn't work as savings anymore. And like we're having a lot of these second, third order effects, which are causing like flight to other assets, making everything else more expensive. I guess, have you thought about like the petrodollar in a negative interest rate environment? Like, does that break the petrodollar? I know that it is receding to some degree, but like, is there a tie in there, or does the
Yeah.
system still kind of function?
No. That is definitely what's happening. It's breaking. So, and I think Luke Grumman is really good on this. He had a great interview on NLW's show, and he also has his own all kinds of content. But as he describes, like ever since 2014, other nations have basically been like, I don't know if this is going to work anymore. And so China stopped buying treasuries then. They've been like basically divesting from US treasuries since then, as have a lot of other nations. I think he says that over the last few years, there's actually been like a negative demand for treasuries. So there's been like more treasuries sold by other foreign central banks than bought. And now, according to the latest data, I think the US government is the majority buyer of treasuries as they come out. I think 53% is the number he used. So the U.S. government is now sort of the primary buyer of our own debt, right? And I think all these other governments, in a very similar way to the '60s, when like other governments were like, oh my God, I don't think the U.S. can hold the gold peg anymore. We want to redeem our gold. We want to give you our dollars back, and we want that gold. You're kind of seeing something similar start to happen in the last decade. So the petrodollar system is starting to unravel. So you're starting to see these other countries basically say, like in China's case, for example, like they obviously export all this stuff to the US and they receive dollars in return. But instead of like recycling those dollars back into US debt, which allowed the US to do a lot of really expensive things, they're now investing in other stuff, like their own Belt and Road system, where they're trying to like colonize like Africa, Asia, etc. Um, they're investing in hard assets, right? So they're like selling goods and services, and they're getting these pieces of paper, and instead of like holding them and giving value to them, they are trading those pieces of paper away for harder assets. So yeah, I think you are watching the gradual decline of the dollar and of US debt. And a lot of the sort of like, I think this actually is quite important for like the whole MMT discussion, because they're basically saying we don't need to worry about like a debt ceiling or whatever. We can just keep spending until we get inflation. But I mean, clearly, like that inflation is going to come a lot sooner if there's less international demand for the dollar. So again, these are like gradual forces, but this really, honestly, from a realistic, brutal perspective, this really impressive system that was designed by Kissinger and Nixon, that created all this international demand for the dollar, where in a normal market environment it wouldn't exist, because in a normal market environment there'd be lots of different currency trading. We like fixed this kind of monopoly on energy pricing, and it caused all these network effects that gave like many decades of exaggerated dominance to the US dollar. That again is now coming to an end, and there's like less and less demand for the dollar. So that's kind of like I think where we are now.
You brought up China there, and that was kind of, it wasn't as big as the Saudi angle in the piece, but you do definitely talk about like the dictatorship and now the Belt and Road Initiative that is kind of being enabled by this petrodollar system and eurodollar system. Can you, I mean, do you want to like spend a little bit more time talking about China more specifically?
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, again, you had the petrodollar system and the pact with Saudi Arabia like built the engine and created the engine, and the recycling again was hugely geopolitically powerful in the 70s, 80s, into the 90s. But eventually, we kind of outgrew. We needed more people to buy our stuff than just the Saudis. Like if you actually look at like sovereign wealth funds and foreign banks today, like they don't own a huge percentage of our debt. Like China owns, or at least until recently, they owned a ton of it. Japan owned a lot of it. So we needed to find like more buyers to create the output of the system. And again, yeah, like as a lot of people say, like allowing China into the World Trade Organization in 2001 really helped spark our ability to do more business with them and export more jobs to them. And essentially, like we were exporting treasuries in return for goods and services in a way. Um, and again, that like allowed them to, they that was really good for them. And this is what a lot of these macro thinkers argue now, is that the current system is actually like the current petrodollar system, which is in decline, is quite favorable to a lot of dictators. Like it's obviously favorable to the Saudis because we protect them. It's pretty favorable to Putin because, I mean, in general, it's like good for the fossil fuel industry and the oil industry, and it's certainly been good for China as well. Right now, the way that they're manipulating that is they're able to, use these, use these dollars in exchange for hard assets, which they are continuing to stockpile. So I guess again, the idea is like if you truly are interested in like global democracy and human rights, even beyond just like the obvious stuff with our entanglements in the Middle East, there's just like this broader idea of like maybe going beyond the petrodollar would in one way or another uh, help bring sort of less sort of like civil liberties violations, less conflict around the world.
Awesome. I just let a couple people in who are raising their hand. Lucas, do you have any kind of questions or thoughts you'd like to share with Alex?
Yeah, I had a question for you, Alex. Kind of like, what do you think is the current American politicians, like, what is their stance as far as the U.S. petrodollar as it relates to Bitcoin? Do you think that they know this is coming and it's inevitable? I mean, they can't come out and say we're ending the U.S. dollar standard because everything would collapse. They kind of have to continue to kick the can down the road, continue to print. Do you think that they know that this is like inevitable and it's coming, or do you think they're just kind of doing what they've always done?
Well, look, there's like tens of thousands of people who run the U.S. government, right? And I would say that the overwhelming majority of them don't really know what Bitcoin is. Like we're extremely early. Um, I would say it's very different than the transition that we had in the 60s and 70s, because that was like really clear to everybody. Like you can go back and read newspaper clippings at the time. Uh, Everybody knew that the dollar pegged to gold was under stress. This was major world news. Like this was continually reported on the front pages of newspapers throughout the end of the 60s and into the 70s. Like everybody knew that Vietnam and the social spending in the US was putting strain on the system and that it probably had to change. Um, Similarly, today we have foreign wars and social spending that is astronomical, and people kind of know that it's not sustainable, but there is no such like transparent peg, right? So there's not as much kind of pressure to talk about what's next. It's like this general decline, again, which macroeconomic thinkers have been observing. Um, but I would say that, like, in general, I think we're too early. I think that very, very few policymakers understand this. I think this is kind of what Peter Thiel was trying to intimate with his remarks last month, was that, like, he was trying to, I guess, wake American policymakers up to this, that, like, maybe we need to start competing in this area. And I think a handful of people know that this is a possibility. But no, I don't think it's been talked about enough. And I think I would imagine that most policymakers, especially at state or Department of Defense, would have trouble even differentiating Bitcoin from other cryptocurrencies. Like I think it's pretty early for them.
Mitch, you want to
Hypothetically,
jump in?
oh, sorry.
No, Lucas, go ahead if you got something.
I was just gonna say hypothetically, like what are what are the benefits of any of them even trying to sustain the U.S. dollar dominance at this point? Like, if say that they do wake up tomorrow, are they going to change what they say? What would be their angle or their reason for doing that?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, right now, it may be actually advantageous for the dollar to weaken a little bit and for us to bring back some of this export stuff that we've exported onto shore. Like, for example, for national security reasons. Like, we may want to have more medical and military and kind of equipment supply chains inside the United States, right? Like, we may want to manufacture more here, but that necessarily entails, some sort of tweak to the system whereby like we could do that competitively again. So there are arguments for like, the weakening of the dollar, dominance. That there are national security arguments for that are being discussed right now. But I guess the point is like if you can start to realize what's gonna sort of happen here over the next decade or two, and maybe even faster than that with Bitcoin, like, yeah, I mean, it's not like we're gonna go even in the craziest scenario to like no fiat money at all. I mean, what may indeed end up happening is that we again, we live in this gradual transition where there are all these fiat currencies from different nations that are issued that begin to sort of be repegged in a way to Bitcoin as in a way that they were kind of pegged to the dollar, and an adjustable rate in the Bretton Woods system, which was ultimately pegged on gold, right? Like, so you may start to see like just sort of a repegging. So, I mean, we don't know, no one knows, but like clearly this is how it used to work, and we could go back in that direction, and maybe that's very favorable to the U.S. I mean, maybe the U.S. reasserts a kind of Bretton Woods type system where everybody pegs to the dollar, and then we're pegged to Bitcoin. I mean, who knows? I mean, these are all possibilities that I think should be discussed and dialogued on, and we should get a lot of smart people to think about this. If you care about America and you want us to continue to be global leaders, because in my, I guess, and here's where I would probably disagree with a lot of the like very left wing critics of the petrodollar. I would rather have America be in the lead than China, completely and 100%. So I'd love to see us still be dynamic and a leader. I just think we can do it without a lot of these negative externalities. So I think there should be conferences, events, workshops, dialogues, roundtables. Like, we should really research papers. We should really start to think about how can America leverage this. And I think Nick Carter talks a lot about this as well, but like, we are in position to capitalize here. Like, we have an open capital market. We have individual rights. We have property rights. We have free speech. These are all things that Bitcoin reverberates with, obviously. Like, Bitcoin is property rights. Bitcoin is free speech. Communist countries that have closed capital markets and human rights violations that are at mass, at scale, it's not going to be a good transition for them, right? So I think that, again, we need to really start thinking about this in a serious way, and I think our policymakers do too. And I just think they're lagging a little bit. I mean, I think it will take a few years for them to grasp this.
Great, awesome. Thanks, Alex.
Just to add on, like, I personally love to watch the developments of the P2P markets, and it is really clear that Bitcoin is one of the most liquid currencies, if not the most liquid currencies, against the long tail of fiat. It is really impressive to see it emerge. And I mean, you could ask Jack of Strike, Jack Mahlers, like, that's his business, is he is betting on Bitcoin's liquidity, and that's how he's rolling out his fiat to Bitcoin product across the globe.
So, Alex, just to add on what you were talking about, with the collapse of the petrodollar, I think what they're doing is they're kind of like forcing the hand of everybody. So people are losing money. They're losing money due to inflation, and they're forcing people into like a speculative attack by adding Bitcoin, to their balance sheet, or buying Bitcoin, or storing their wealth in Bitcoin. Do you think do you think this is a good thing to happen over? Is it going to happen over like a quick period of time, like a short period of time? Um, like, how does that look to you?
I mean, it's interesting to look at history, right? I mean, look at the price of gold in the 70s, right? I mean, it reached its real all-time high, meaning I'm pretty sure if you look at like real prices compared to other things, gold still isn't as expensive as it was in the 70s, right? Um, People in that time of uncertainty flocked to it, right? Especially as it became like legal for Americans to hold again. So yeah, I think it's natural that both individuals, corporations, and others are gonna. Again, the narrative is like as inflation hedge, right? So that's we're moving from Bitcoin as this like magic internet money Silk Road thing to a interesting frontier technology, and now to like an inflation hedge. And that's kind of the narrative that I think you're going to start seeing become more popularized, right? Both for corporations and eventually for governments. But eventually it's not so much an inflation hedge, but more like the asset that you want, like as the to settle balance of payments with. um and again, I think in doing this, uh the interesting part here is that for me as a human rights person, the really interesting part is that just this isn't just for governments. um, Anybody can access this thing, not just any government, but any individual can access this network. And that's just, we've never had a world like that before. That has not existed. Even in the gold standard, gold was highly controlled, highly custodied. I mean, the majority of it was like completely not even available for private markets for some time, right? Like we're talking like incredibly centralized. Uh, towards the end of the gold standard, like that is just not a technical possibility with Bitcoin. There's millions of people who custody their own Bitcoin, and it's complete, the network and all of its effects and the way it works is scattered around the world. So it's very different. I think you can look at history and you can say that the US is coming under stress now, just like it was pre 1971, and the system is probably going to change. But there's just so many different there's so many differences to that system then, right? Like, and we don't know what's going to come next. I mean, again, like I guess what I'm suggesting is in the same way that Kissinger and Nixon figured out that they could create global demand for dollars by tying it to oil. I mean, maybe that can be done by building a really badass Bitcoin position and pegging the dollar to that. Like I don't know. These are things that I think the people who lead my country should be thinking about right now.
Yeah. And just, you know, like echoing on the hash wars and everything with global competition with Bitcoin. Obviously, it seems like right now it's starting from the ground up. So the people are adopting it. The people are making, they're making these, making businesses and building them around Bitcoin. How can, and I think Wyoming's big too on regulation and that spreading to other states. Other states are adopting Wyoming's stance on that. Um, is it really, is it like this? It seems like the ground up is good, but how can the US really step in for these global hash wars?
Well, I mean, you just described it. I mean, we have a somewhat decentralized government. Like we have vast territories that have major natural resources that can have different policies from each other. Like we are well positioned. Like, I mean, we have Texas. China has Tibet, right? Like Texans can like have an energy grid that is different. Like they can have different laws and rules, and they can push back against the central government. That I think that's just so much more advantageous for Bitcoin than the Chinese model, which is like we are going to go subjugate Tibet and they're going to have no power whatsoever, and everything's going to be closed, and they're not going to be able to learn about what happened at Tiananmen Square. Like this kind of very closed, again, closed, controlled, authoritarian structure is I think extremely at odds with Bitcoin, and Bitcoin will not treat that very well. Like that's going to be a very unpleasant transition for them. I don't think it'll be so pleasant for anybody who's used to like the Cantillon effect, etc. But at least here, again, we have open capital markets, we have property rights, we have these basic values, we have a bit of a decentralized country. So I think it'll be more advantageous for us than others.
Yeah, it's going to be
Awesome.
interesting to watch.
Hey, so next in line, I think we have Justin and then Rico. Justin, do you have a question for Alex?
Yeah, can you guys hear me? Is this working okay?
Yeah.
You sound great.
Awesome. Hey, huge fan of your work. Thanks for having me on. I've spent a lot of time thinking about geopolitical strategies over the years, and one of the books that's come to mind in reading through some of your recent work is Peter Zeihan's Accidental Superpower, which talked a lot about the petrodollar and how that has secured, the U.S. effectively has gained power through their dominance in being the de facto naval authority worldwide since the 40s and 50s. But he also then goes on to talk about the emerging energy independence that we will create through our um, through our natural gas resources and through fracking, and predicts kind of a move towards isolationism, which I think that's where I started to diverge with his thinking, not really seeing the US wanting to give up its presence globally. Um, but he just this morning tweeted that he continues to see Bitcoin as just like not even uh, something worth considering. And I'm curious to get your take on. I know that you talked about this with Preston on his podcast about how it seems so crazy that so many geopolitical analysts and politicians continue to not be able to recognize the value of Bitcoin, not only from a financial security aspect, but also from
Sure.
securing human rights.
Well, on the first point, I mean, we were already pretty sovereign in 2002. Like we already got most of our oil, as speaking as an American, like from ourselves, from Canada, from Mexico, from Venezuela. Like we weren't very reliant on the Middle East. So this idea that like we took all this action to for the oil itself never really made sense to me. And indeed, as you mentioned, like we have been all the shale oil fracking, all this stuff, like that's been happening in the last 15 years, right? Like that hasn't really changed. The point is not where the oil is necessarily, but um, do you have to pay for it in dollars, right? That's I guess the whole point of this conversation. So that is the part that's breaking down now in the last few years as you're watching the Nord Stream. If you look at Biden, I mean, his team again has like said they want to kill, literally kill is the word they use. They want to kill Nord Stream, um, and they want to reduce as much as they can this newly emerging relationship between Russia and Europe, right? So I think again, it's about like the pricing and the network effect of the pricing. But as far as like this historian who may actually, and I'm sure if I read the book, I would agree with a lot of it. But the point is that there is this disbelief in Bitcoin, and there are other people too who I think really accurately describe what's happening with the petrodollar. Like a lot of the people I cite probably hate Bitcoin, but they are really accurate in describing the flaws of the petrodollar system. I think that it's a it, it, it it's just the way that it's been unfolded. It's the way that things have unfolded. Like Bitcoin is very strange. It had a very bizarre beginning. The media, the mainstream media, has been very negative on it for a decade, and that really has a mental impact on people. The kind of like general default position is that it's this like sketchy, volatile thing that is, you know, terrible for the world and only enriches a handful of people, and that's just a hard thing to shake. And uh, you know, there is this moment when you start taking it seriously, and you're starting to see a lot more people get orange pilled, right? But someone's got to give you the orange pill. Like if you don't have the orange pill, like like it, you really dismiss this thing. So unfortunately, a lot of these really good geopolitical thinkers, political scientists, um, they don't get it. And it's interesting to see that some of the macro thinkers really understand it, but that's because they're fixated on finance and markets. But a lot of people focused on politics, political theory, humanitarian aid, that stuff. Like they're not looking at those things, and they're just seeing like what the media is telling them. And it is kind of what it is. And in some ways, I guess you could argue that it's actually been good for Bitcoin because it's allowed Bitcoin to grow and get to where it is today, where it's made that transition into the inflation hedge asset. without a lot of, I guess, scrutiny or pushback. I mean, now it's sort of too late, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that the orange pilling people using the NGU technology or any of the financial components of Bitcoin is really hard to kind of break through and to crack the shell that the negative media coverage has given them. But your work talking about how it empowers human rights globally, as well as CK mentioned earlier, Jack Maller's work with remittances. I mean, the, those two alone for me are just the easiest way to be able to convert people to understanding how powerful this tech is. So thanks for having me on.
Sure. Yeah, and we haven't touched on it yet, but I think this other idea of put Bitcoin aside for a second and let's be like really clear about these negative externalities of the current system that we enjoy as Americans, right? When I say we, I assume like we're talking coastal elites here essentially, like and the top 5%, the asset owners, the political class, like the petrodollar system has been really good for them. But again, we have, to be clear, negative externalities when it comes to the environment, the sort of pressure on nuclear energy, renewables. We have the negative externality of our support for dictatorships, foreign wars, which we may not have gotten in otherwise. And again, this like kind of like issue of inequality, which leads to populism. I mean, there's a lot of things here. Before we even get to the idea of the carbon footprint of like the U.S. military, which is required to support the petrodollar, right? So forget Bitcoin for a second. Like, I think there should be a more robust conversation about like the I guess the negative externalities of the dollar. And it's bizarre to see this never discussed. Like every critic of Bitcoin goes right for the jugular of the carbon emission. Okay. And when you actually ask them, well, how do you feel about the environmental and human impact of the currency that you use? It's like they have, it's like clearly they haven't thought of that, and they kind of laugh it off. And I think that's where we can make some inroads here on.
I definitely agree that there's a lot of inroads to be made there, and I applaud you for with this piece is like a fantastic piece of content in order to give them to be like, well, what do you say about this? Like, this is just a small insight into the costs of the dollar system over the years. If you try to quantify that in any way and compare it to Bitcoin, it's obvious that Bitcoin is an order of magnitude improved.
Yeah, I mean, look, again, we're talking about potentially a future where we have a global reserve currency that's neutral, and that cannot be manipulated by one country. And as much as I love America and the values we were founded on, not necessarily what has happened since, but we are talking about a situation, just to be frank, where 4% of the world's population essentially has this exorbitant privilege over the other 96%. And that's just clearly unfair. I mean, clearly. So maybe we can move to a world where things are a little more fair. And I still think in that world, I try to make the case that we will be in really good position because of our values and because of our open nature compared to more closed and corrupt regimes.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Rico, do you have a question for Alex?
Yeah, I do. I kind of just wanted to say thank you, first of all, CK and Bitcoin Magazine and Alex Gladstein for everything you do. Like your talks, I like run to listen to. I just wanted to kind of mention on what you were saying about like kind of put Bitcoin aside and just talk about like commodities and things like lumber, and to realize that like I've got friends. I'm in Paris, but like I've got friends that build houses or in Florida, and like they've noticed like just yesterday on Fortune magazine they said 200 lumber prices are up 232%, and like people are actually like learning that they have to hedge themselves from this inflation. And so like kind of going back really quick on the petrodollar, stating that like when the petrol was being like front run by future markets and like it was costing more money to like the people were making more money on these like derivatives and these options and futures for like contracts pretty much just like arbitrage, and like it happens in Bitcoin as well. But like when you see it with the petrol, literally, and like commodities and things going up, just trying to hedge from like this petrodollar, it's kind of gotten out of control. And like Meester wrote a really good article about this in his Medium post a while back, like saying, the fact that like a long time ago we used to use like whales and like whale fat and stuff, and then the petrol came in and like coal came in, and there was this huge run to like change to a new medium of like energy. And like interesting enough, like the petrodollar is based off of an energy that like is very liquid in its sense as well. But the United States has capitalized on that with Saudi Arabia, and even when Saudi Arabia became like into the petrol field or the whole thing with the dollar, um, that was huge. I mean, there's some great documentaries on the whole that thing coming into like place, and like making sure that Saudi Arabia and has like its long hold and the dollar and everything and that whole thing. But I think we're at the end, and so like we have this new version of money based off of electricity. And like again, putting Bitcoin aside and just realizing that commodities are going up, like people are hedging into lumber because they know they can get returns on it. So my question to you is like, I know that like if you look at the 92-year the Dow Jones Industry Average, it's got like we're supposed to have a reset in like the next 10 weeks. Some economists are saying. Do you think that like and like with the CBDCs coming out in China and stuff and other small like nation states and island places that are doing CBDCs, do you think that the CBDC in a sense would just continue on this fractional reserve banking, or do you think there might be a debt jubilee that like what do you see happening with the CBDC, and if you can maybe just kind of comment on that?
Sure. Well, I think just generally speaking, I guess what I'm describing are like long-term forces. Like there's this like behind the scenes unraveling of the system. On top of that are kind of normal market forces and cycles. Like clearly there was like a huge shutdown of the world economy a year ago. So a lot of the numbers you're seeing are obviously reflective of that. Like there was no lumber demand a year ago. Now there's a lot. So, but I do agree that obviously we're like clearly these commodities are getting more expensive in dollar terms over time. Like if you look 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, even if we're throw out the last 12 months because of this like crazy economic shutdown, I think the trends are clearly pointing in this direction. And the thing is, like, look, I mean, it almost underlined how important the dollar was. Again, like it's fading, but again, we're still at like governments when they are actually sitting with their counselors and thinking about what should we actually store our value in, it's 60% dollars still. So like that's the global picture, right? Like 20% euros and then like a smattering of other currencies, right? So that's one. The Chinese currency is like at like 2 or 3%. Okay, so it's treated as like a very fringe speculative asset, essentially. Like no one really trusts it. It has a similarly small percentage of global trade. So I guess I'm not really worried about. I mean, I'm very worried for the Chinese people about the digital yuan and the DCEP project because I think it's going to completely eliminate any civil liberties they still have from the ability to use cash. So I'm very worried for them. I think this is not like we shouldn't be callous about. Like a lot of the writing has been pretty callous, I think, in America about let's just like look at the Chinese experiment and we'll we'll unroll our CBDC better here. It's a very dehumanizing concept to think that there's not going to be like a human toll on the much larger amount of people who live in China than in the United States. So as long as we're like empathetic with them and what's happening. But on the other hand, I think we can understand that like it seems unlikely that the world's just going to start like investing its store of value in Chinese currency run by the CCP. That seems there's very little evidence that shows that that's going to happen. But again, the dollar is weakening inevitably over time. So it's in such a position of strength in like the late 90s, early 2000s that it's just going to take so long for it to unwind. But then again, we have the gradually then suddenly thing. Like we don't know what the big moment's going to be. I mean, again, Bretton Woods took it was people already realized how sustainable it was in the early 60s, and it took a full decade for it to come to a head. So there's a robust debate over whether or not our system is sustainable now. A lot of people still think it is. I mean, so I think, a lot's going to unfold in the next decade. But I do think it is inevitable that people are going to start looking at Bitcoin as more of this like store value asset. And as soon as it penetrates the political realm, you're going to start to see some major change. And I hope that the US can prepare itself for that so that we do not lose to, let's say, like less free nations.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think my pickle, like with Bitcoin, it's what would be the difference between and I don't think anybody's really ever explained this to me. What would be the difference between gold and crypto or just Bitcoin in this
Gold
conversation?
is a open system and Bitcoin is a closed system. So you can inflate gold, you can continue to pump more gold into it, you can mine more. It's centrally controlled. Bitcoin is not centralized. It's a closed system. There's only 21 million. That's basically the
Yeah,
big
but
difference.
like with gold, it's like highly inelastic though. Like I'm sure you can mine for more, but you're not. It's not like you can
Yeah,
find like double the
Hey,
amount next year. You know.
Mitch, let's let Alex have a try at this.
Yeah, I mean, look, yeah, I agree with Mitch in terms of the way that clearly, like, gold is completely captured by corporate interests. Like the asset itself is decentralized in as much as like no one created it. It naturally exists. It has natural scarcity, natural decentralized scarcity. But the powers that can like actually maintain the flow of it are highly manipulated. And they are in control. No one can control the flow of Bitcoin. Every 10 minutes, like a certain amount will come out, and that is like unstoppable. You're right in that, like like let's say as a base money, just like gold was like too restrictive for the U.S. to rely on to be able to do the Vietnam War and social spending at the same time. I think that Bitcoin will be restraining for sure. And I think that governments are going to have to make hard decisions, whereas right now they can put them off into the future. Like, so for example, right now, the US not only finances like this enormous military presence around the world, which clearly could be downsized, but also like we've been very wasteful with the social spending we do make. Like per capita, we spend way more on healthcare than any other like advanced economy. Like if you just look at a chart of it, like there's so much waste there. So and that's again partly because we have no like restraining mechanism to push us back. So I think that the Bitcoin system will bring new opportunities and new restraints. I think that things like forever wars and hugely wasteful social spending will be restrained a little bit for sure as we move into this new system. But also you get the fact that like everybody gets into the system. Everybody can have dibs, like individuals, corporations. Like this isn't just for governments anymore. So I do think the big debate of the future is uh, like how do Western democracies deal with the fact that probably the reserve currency that they will run on in several in the future will be completely scarce. So how does that change the way that they interact with their populations, and how does that change the idea of social welfare? That's a really good argument and debate to have, and we should keep having that conversation. But I mean, clearly, what seems obvious is that like stuff like forever wars and gulags and these things are just going to be like very expensive to run in the system.
I just yeah, and I'll stop talking after this because I know other people want to talk. But I mean, you were just talking about like the the ability for it to be a little bit more democratized or it's just it's going to be a little bit more freer or less restricted because it's not going to be owned by corporate interests like gold is. But like the top 1,000 Bitcoin owners own more than 40% of all of Bitcoin. And like when you look at it that way, you already have an entity of people more or less that are able to control the market, right? And it's not as centralized if someone can control the value, if they can just dump it. My thing is that like I believe in crypto. I just don't. I think it's too late for the world to adopt Bitcoin as a whole because I just think it's too saturated. Um, with people,
Okay,
and
well,
that'd be my last thing.
thank you for your thoughts. I mean, I think you share a very common view that a lot of people have. So I think thank you for sharing it. I think that you should consider looking at the structure of Bitcoin holdings and how they work. Like it's very different than what you have described here. Like in fact, like the top couple addresses are exchanges which hold the value of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people, and they can't just kind of do whatever they want. So it's something that's worth looking at more. But again, again, this idea of like a base money that's very restrictive is going to have different effects that we need to discuss. And one of those things is going to be that I'm excited about is it's going to probably make things like forever wars much less feasible. And again, like the fact that it won't be tied to oil, very helpful for like not propping up dictators who do bad things. But there will be a robust debate about the ability to do any sort of like social subsidization. So I don't know. Maybe Bitcoin Tina has something to add there.
Well, a couple of things. I think as Americans, we don't see ourselves well as the rest of the world sees us. I think we're perceived around the world generally as a bully. I think that I think we're seen as a bully with our military. I think we're seen as a bully with our financial system. I think we've become spoiled like trust fund grand and great grandchildren who benefited from remarkable work and success done by people who came before us, spending it without regard to our ability to replace it. And we're wasting a valuable legacy given to us by people who came before us and created a tremendous economy and tremendous advantages which we've all as in a nation benefited very much from. I think we underestimate how angry the current situation makes many people around the world. And through wasteful practices and misusing this benefit of our inheritance, many people will find a very rude, nasty awakening. It's hard to know exactly how things progress. I know there's a strong narrative about inflation, but I'm very mixed on that whole narrative about inflation because at the same time there's enormous debt production which produces very aggressive deflation. And I don't happen to stand certain about the idea of an aggressive inflation, of course, unless you do very aggressive governmental spending. Very aggressive governmental spending with UBI will probably give us a pretty aggressive inflation. And there is an assumption that we can continue to live this way for a long time because, after all, we have lived this way for a very long time. But systems and even though they're incredibly large and don't necessarily fall apart early on from abuse and misuse, that does take its toll over time. I think we're showing the stresses internally of a lot of anger that people have. I think people think that anger is directed and ought to be directed politically. I think the anger is more at the base of the financial system and monetary system that we have. And I think that the risk that people have is that not understanding the nature of exponential curves. And so things can look linear for a long time and then fall apart very rapidly. And that's the whole notion of gradually, then suddenly. And so I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about how much time we have and how much time we don't have. And it's not clear to me what the right answer is to this. And I think we've created a lot of problems. And I think we don't fully appreciate or understand them. And we think we have endless amounts of time to fix these problems. I don't think it's endless amounts of time. I don't think it lasts more than 10 years. And by the way, 10 years may seem like a long time to you. It's not. And I think that there's a misunderstanding about the role of the United States in this world. And there will be a lot of countries and a lot of people who will be very happy to see the USA get its comeuppance.
Do you think that there'll be like a similar kind of global like gradual building anxiety as there was in the late 60s over the US, like kind of screwing up its role as guarantor of the system? Do you think we'll kind of start to see that, or no?
It's hard to say. I don't really know. I
Well,
think
that's what
that I
I'm
think
going to be
things do.
looking for.
I think things do take their toll, and I think that um, you have countries who we're competing against who have really terrible views on human rights and civil liberties, and even with internal differences in this country, we still think we do have a base point of view on rights and freedoms as accorded by our Constitution. And there are other people around the world who do not see it the way we see it. And that's problematic. So it's very complicated, and I think we lose sight of where we are, where we might be
Yeah,
going.
I also think like we should detach the conversation about the decline of the dollar is one thing, but that's kind of a negative view. There's also the rise of any country and its ability to, transform energy locally in a sovereign, independent way into potentially the world's base currency. I mean, that's going to be just like a very different situation where you have a lot of countries. Um, a lot of them are run in a fairly democratic way. Some of them are not. Most of them are not, but a lot of them are, who can now transform stuff like hydro energy into potentially the world's future base money. So, and not just governments, but movements and individuals. And like, for example, you've got in the Congo now, you have an incredible ecological park that's mining Bitcoin with hydro energy. And like I think it just gives more power to like local community type stuff around the world as well. So I don't want to focus all on like kind of this inevitable decline of the dollar in America, but there's also this really interesting upside of like the rise of other like independent groups and organizations around the world, as over the next 100 years they'll get to participate in the harvesting of this base money.
Well, I would go even further and say that because of the nature of the incentive system of Bitcoin, that Bitcoin creates a drive towards innovative use of energy, which is more incentivized in Bitcoin than anything else. And that's really quite important, because I think that will impact humanity's use of energy going forward for the next millennia.
I spoke Alex, real quick.
Yeah.
I just want to let everyone know that we have about 10 more minutes with Alex. Alex, let's, I guess, continue on this thought, but a couple other people here who may want to sneak in a question before you have to go.
Just quickly, I've got, I spoke to someone who works in like basically nuclear energy advocacy. And she was telling me about the way that even today, like the World Bank still will not support this sort of energy infrastructure in emerging markets. It's still discouraged from doing so by the U.S. And like we can talk about how much does the petrodollar still play a role in that decision making, but clearly that's kind of where that hesitancy came from, right? And even whether or not it's still the factor, it's still a factor. So I don't know. It'd be interesting to hear what Mags has to say on this topic.
Sorry, I missed part of it. I heard that there's someone from the nuclear energy and
someone got in touch with me, and she's campaigning for us to be more reliant on nuclear, like not just in America but around the world. And she was saying that there is still a discouragement from, like, for example, the World Bank when it makes investments in emerging markets. Like they won't fund nuclear development of nuclear energy.
Yeah, based on kind of policy experience. So I think it depends on which jurisdiction that you're in. For example, Canada, we're supportive of nuclear. We're refurbishing our plants. We see it as a low carbon future option. In terms of the World Bank, like I know it's not a government association.
Would you guys give a loan or support to like Paraguay or like?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying is like emerging markets have been basically really discouraged from building this infrastructure and becoming energy independent. This is like quite clear over the last 3-4 decades, and it was really striking in the 70s and 80s, like so much so that like major political upheaval was arguably tied to this. Maybe less so recently, But maybe this is the moment where it turns around.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, especially with the low carbon narrative gaining more and more footholds among government. It's a tricky one too, giving, especially in a time where a lot of countries are facing crisis, giving money to other areas. Like you see it play out, like U.S. or Canada giving X amount of money for aid to this country when your own country is suffering. It's a tough uh, political landscape to navigate. I do hope the sustainability angle will kind of make that shift, and also potentially some countries to kind of reverse their policies. Germany moved away from nuclear, right? Uh, because of policy reasons, and they had concerns about waste. So TBD, what happens as climate change commitments get closer to 2050? I remember 2030 seemed a long way away, and it's not anymore, right? And neither is 2050.
Right. I mean, again, it's like the grand irony here of some of these countries which export uranium. I mean, the Congo gave us all the uranium for the Manhattan Project, pretty much. They have this incredible type of uranium that's like not found elsewhere. And the people in the Congo have like not seen. They don't have like grand nuclear power plants. Like all of that has been like moved elsewhere due to like the structure of the world. And it just seems really exciting that like rather than having a reliance on like industry, infrastructure, military, like to be able to get the best assets in the world and produce them, that like anyone can convert their time and energy personally into potentially the world's future-based money by just buying it or exchanging something for it, which hasn't been possible before in that same way, or that like local uh, groups can as evidenced in Virunga in the Congo can harness local sources of energy to create said base money. So that's going to be very interesting, and I think that can't be talked about enough, this idea of like more equal access to the future base money as opposed to something that was like highly centralized, custodied, and controlled.
I think too, when it comes to nuclear, what's kind of exciting is small nuclear power reactors. There continues to be a lot of research, and I don't think they're there yet. But if you look at historically, we centralized everything, including power production. A nuclear plant, for example, in Ontario, provides 50% of base load, and you know it's not like we have many plants. It's like one large plant provides, or two large plant provide a significant amount for that area of a population. And so that does though create different constraints, for example transmission constraints. And so once we start to decentralize uh, things like our energy systems, there's different, you don't come into this kind of an environment. We hear about transmission constraints too when it comes to renewables, right? If you set up a giant wind or solar plant, because this is the optimal place to locate them, in some ways they haven't been able to service the large population centers because those aren't necessarily connected. So it'll be interesting to see how small nuclear power reactors roll out. And honestly, I think there could be impacts related to Bitcoin mining there as well, as a clean energy source. But I do think, like, we keep seeing everything decentralized, and it can be good.
Right. Big picture, aside from your own Canada and Norway, I mean, all the other oil exporters are dictatorships in top 15 in the world, pretty much. If you just look at a list, or like 90% of them are like authoritarian regimes, right? So, and this practice of just literally digging this thing out of the ground and selling it does not require like development of like intellectual capital in your country, does not require political reform, can be done by tyranny very, very easily. It's actually, known as like this sort of like rentier state phenomenon. So if that's taken away by a shift to um, other kinds of energy that is not the same, that is different, then we take out a major like sort of support network for dictatorships, and we kind of force them to reform like necessarily and deal more with their people and have more of a dialogue, et cetera, et cetera. So if your economy is more based on like services and technology and all these things, like like necessarily there's just more opening that happens. So it's going to be kind of interesting to see, hopefully, the like downfall. I mean, I'm certainly, again, I want to make this clear. I'm like pro-America, anti-dictator, and I think that like rooting for the downfall of the petrodollar system is really good for both things, and really just helps us check all these kind of really costly negative externalities that have been overlooked continually, with regard to our, again, support for oil, support for dictators, support for wars, and support for this system that increases inequality. So maybe we kind of conclude there, CK. But this has been great.
Yeah, Alex, I just had a complete brain blast right there on your last point about how the majority of oil exporters are dictatorships, and how moving away from oil is kind of in itself a pro-freedom move. So that is very interesting. And then obviously Bitcoiners think that Bitcoin makes it easier to move away from oil. Alex, why don't you kind of give your last word to the audience, and then for everyone else in here, would love to keep this room alive. Gonna try not to kill it after Alex leaves, but hand it back to you, Alex.
Sure. Well, look. There's not a lot of. You have to really dig to find good scholarly work here. And one thing I would caution is that essentially, for whatever reason, there's like a lot of like, and you have to just you have to be careful. There's a lot of like, if you start digging into the petrodollar, you're gonna start coming into stuff that, it is to me, like real conspiracy theories. Like I think this is all real. I think this is what happened. I tried to make the case that this is really a really big driver of how things have happened in the world. But you'll come across some other stuff too that I didn't feel comfortable putting in the article, because I just didn't find the evidence linking it directly back to this. So it's an area that is ignored by like academia and mainstream media generally, like, and therefore when you're looking at it, a lot of the sources you're going to look at are like really fringe stuff. Now there's a lot of grains of truth in there, and it's a lot of fun to read regardless. But what I really tried to do in the article is make sure that every source was very reputable, even if I didn't agree with it. Like I really tried to do that just to sort of prove, with completely kind of like, let's say, mainstream, whether it be mainstream left or mainstream right or whatever, but at least like rep sources. I just wanted to like show people that, so that this isn't like something sourced from like fringe blogs. And I think that that's quite important. Like all of the sources I used for this article are very reputable, or like even like celebrated, and like unspoken about. Like again, like a lot of people on the center left or left really love David Graeber, again, who I disagree with, but his his explanation of the petrodollar system is absolutely, stellar, and he really nails it, and it's really worth reading. The rest of the book, maybe not so much, but like that part, he really nails. So I thought that was interesting. And just be careful out there when you're digging around on this topic, because there's a lot of stuff that you need to just kind of think carefully about. I hope that helps.
Awesome. That was fantastic. Again, thank you, Alex. Have a great rest of your day. Really appreciate all the time. Really appreciate you.
Thanks, guys, and we'll do more soon. Thank you.
Peace. All right, y'all. I mean, we can keep this